We begin today with the most important subject that we will ever deal with on this channel. While there's a lot of things that are important and things to talk about, this one, in my estimation, is probably one, if not the most important. You will recall in my first video that we talked about Bible epistemology. This is a different aspect of epistemology, and this deals directly with knowledge. Now, a famous saying is by Francis Bacon, and it says, knowledge is power, and then he says, power is knowledge. So he uses them interchangeably. Well, that is not quite correct, especially in the way we understand what power is. Knowledge is not power. Power is power. So the task for today is, what is power? And I give fair warning that when we define the word power today, it will not be sufficient. It will not be good enough, because there are few subjects in human existence that is more difficult to define than the concept of power. I mean, if you ask somebody, you say, what is power? Well, in our head, we know what it is. But if you ask us to articulate it, it becomes very, very difficult to tell what it is and be accurate about what it is, to be specific about what it is. But power is like that because that is the nature of power. Power always wants to retain its anonymity. So the attempt today, or my attempt today, is an attempt to sketch out, because we're going to put this in the context of the Bible. My attempt today is to sketch out the history of power in biblical interpretation as told by those in power who were the ones who established the interpretational systems of the biblical text. In other words, the people who actually set down and developed our methods and ideas of Bible interpretation. Okay, to start with, power is not a thing. Power is a relationship. Think about it this way. Think about power like you would gravity. You can't directly observe gravity. I mean, you can see the effects all around you. You push a cup off the table, you can see gravity operating, but you cannot actually observe gravity itself. But you know it exists, you know it's working, you know it's functioning, but you can't really directly observe what it is. Power is very much like that. Power is very difficult. We see the effects, we see it working, but we can't observe it directly. Gravity is part of our physical world, but power is part of our social world. And because our passions, our beliefs, our ideas, our feelings, all those kinds of things are wrapped up in it, that makes power even that much more difficult to understand, to see, to observe. So, let me take a stab at it. Let's see if we can get us into the ballpark. Here is a definition of power. Power is an inherent fabric of force relations that operate in its own sphere of domain by means of discourse or talk. Now, that definition in and of itself is not good enough because it doesn't accurately describe power, but then again, we don't really have a good definition of what power is, yet it is operating. So, let's look at a little bit of how we have developed our ideas concerning how power interacts with the Bible or our religious ideas. Ethiopian philosopher Yakob, he is a 17th century philosopher, and we will talk to him first. Let me say this. If you get sick, you go to a doctor, okay? You go to the doctor because they are the best and most qualified person to be able to address your sickness, okay? If you want a house built, you go to a carpenter. And you go to the carpenter because he is the best person to address building a house. Well, when it comes to power, who do you go to? You go to philosophers. And so philosophy is the discipline that to date has actually defined what we understand power to be. That doesn't mean that your doctor doesn't make mistakes in taking care of your health. Yes, he can make mistakes, and he can also make mistakes in the treatment or the drugs or his advice to you. Yeah, those are all possible. But the doctor is still your best bet for addressing your illness. When it comes to philosophy, when it comes to power, and you ask philosophers, yes, it's possible that they are wrong. It's possible that they're not as accurate as you would like for them to be, and you may have a very different opinion too. But philosophers are your best bet. They are the experts in trying to define power. Now, because of our own passions and feelings and stuff like that, we might have our own ideas about it, but our passions are the ones governing our ideas about it and not necessarily the accuracy of it. So, we're going to start with Ethiopian philosopher Yakob. He published a book called The Hatata. The Hatata was written in 1630. That's a very early year, and that deserves its own story. But he basically says that reason is the way you understand. Well, when it comes to your spirituality, reason within your heart is the way you understand your spirituality. This was a basic concept, an idea, and for the most part, most of us would probably agree with that. However, when it comes to the actual concept of power, we go to German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche is by far the most absolutely terrifying philosophers of all. The way he describes the universe and mankind and power and things like that, it's really, really, really interesting and very, very disturbing in how he describes all of this. And this is what he says. He says, the desire for power is the main driving force in humans. In other words, Nietzsche claims that power is what you want most, not love, not satisfaction, not happiness, but what we want more than anything else is power. We tend to think of power as something negative, but in fact, knowledge is not negative, it's neutral. And because it is neutral, the driving force, like the perpetuation of the species as being one of our drives, there are many drives that we have, and he said the strongest drive of all is power. Now, Michel Foucault, a French philosopher, this is the way he puts it. Knowledge is controlled in every society through mechanisms of power. Anywhere you find knowledge, there you will find power also. In other words, knowledge is a regime of power. You see, knowledge is not power. Power is power, and power recruits knowledge in order to perpetuate itself. When you look at power like this, power becomes something very, very different than the way we usually understand it and as narrow as we understand it. It is a force of nature. It is something that God created, just like gravity, but it has a unique position in understanding human existence. Now, when it comes to power and how we relate to power and how power relations in all of our relationships operate, let's try and show you how power pulls you. When somebody puts on a song, you can choose not to enjoy it. You can choose not to like it. Yes, you have free choice. You have free will. However, music pulls you. Music actually compels you. It arises feelings in you. It coerces you. And so therefore, power in this way, even though you have choice, it pulls you in a certain way, it pushes you, it drives you, it compels you, it forces you, and it can convince you. Power is so powerful that it can actually move you along like a herd, and you can be swept into it, and you can go along with it, and yes, you can resist it. Like rapids, if you're in a boat and you're going downstream and the waves are coming and your boat is being pushed along, yes, you can go the opposite direction. You can. You can jump out the boat and you can swim to shore. Yeah, you have the choice there. But power tends to push you downstream, and your tendency is not to resist it. Now, let's bring this into the biblical world. Let's talk about how power relates to biblical interpretation. It was Winston Churchill who said, "History is written by the victors." I think that's very true. Whoever wins, they're the ones who sit down and write history. When they write history, is it true or is it biased? Well, of course it's biased. We all are biased. Now, let's apply this to biblical interpretation. In the context of biblical hermeneutics, interpretation, in the context of biblical hermeneutics, Europe wrote the actual rules and methods of biblical interpretation. And embedded in Europe's monopoly on interpretation are mechanisms of power. Once we recognize that power is part of how we have developed biblical interpretation, now we are faced with the question of should we challenge it, because Europe hasn't just developed it, they have had a monopoly on it. No one else has been allowed to contribute to interpretation. They have determined it all, and monopolies are never good. It gets even more disturbing. Carter Woodson, the man who founded Black History Month, he writes in his book, The Miseducation of the Negro, this is what he says: "In schools of theology, Negroes are taught the interpretation of the Bible worked out by those who have justified segregation." Now, Woodson saw this as a huge contradiction, that the people who actually perpetrated slavery are the same ones that we go to learn interpretation. Well, Woodson wrote this in 1933, so that was a long time ago. But the question now becomes, do we need to challenge the interpretation of the Bible because Europe has had a complete monopoly on it? And given the history of racism in the Western world, that is red flags. Now, I need to make an important note here. This does not mean church doctrines. Your faith needs to remain intact. Church doctrines is on the upper level. This is a surface phenomenon that church doctrines is on. We are talking about something way more fundamental, something foundational, something that has little to do with your church doctrine, your denominational doctrine, your faith tradition. This has to do with the mechanics and foundation and the hidden rules that go into what constitutes an interpretation. With that in mind, let's take a brief and novel idea, and let's try and put the Bible into the context in which it was written as a method of interpreting it. That means that we would use an African point of view, an African method of interpretation. After all, where we sit right now, our interpretation is Greek. But yet when the Bible was written, when most of the Old Testament was written, the Greeks were nowhere around. They hadn't arrived there yet. So if they have not arrived there, what worldview was the Bible conceptualized? With the Bible, it is a contradiction to use Greek values to interpret an African text. The worldview that the Bible is conceptualized in is Egyptian. How do I know that? Moses wrote the first 5 books, and everybody follows in the genre of the law. Okay, now we come to the first African principle, and that is the personification of a principle of God 1. Remember, if you haven't seen my video on what are the gods, you need to take a look at it. We look at a principle of the one God, and this principle we're looking at right now is going to be Maat. Maat is a principle that means truth, order, law, right, everything that constitutes correctness or righteousness. Now, Maat is feminine, and so she also has a counterpart. Her counterpart is Thoth, from where we get the English word think and thought. He is the personification of interpretation. So we will have to consult these 2 principles of God in order to actually look at the biblical text itself. Now we come to a sticky part. The principle of power. Now remember, the gods are different principles and aspects of God. Okay, in that case, when it comes to power, the principle of power, this aspect of God, the principle of power is the principle Seth. He is known as the Lord of Chaos, the Lord of Evil, the Lord of the Desert. So he is the principle of power and this particular aspect of God. By the way, the Hebrew Satan comes from this word Seth. Satan is Seth, which means the second manifestation of Seth. The principle Seth, because power is so diverse, it's so complicated, it's so difficult to understand. Seth comes in some of the most diverse guises. He has so many different symbols. Why? Because power is very complicated. So Seth is represented as the jackal, the hippopotamus, the serpent, the raven, the donkey, the boar, the goat, the antelope, the camel, and then there is something called the Seth animal, which we still haven't identified yet. Seth is the personification of power, meaning that it is neutral, it can be evil, it can be good, but it is indeed something that God has indeed created. This emerges in the biblical text in Isaiah 45:7, which says, I form the light and create the darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. And when you run through the scriptures, you kind of see this aspect of God, which is a little difficult for us to understand, especially as Christians, because we're not used to thinking about evil being an aspect of God. So we disagree with that in that way. But the Bible definitely presents this kind of an idea. You will remember that the Bible says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And we've tried all types of gymnastics to explain it differently than that. But here again, the objective here is to kind of sketch out the complicated issue of what power really is. The first philosopher, theologian, thinker, it's very difficult to put some of these ideas into English. Remember, we have said in our previous videos that English does not convey African ideas. It's very, very difficult to understand some of these very abstract ideas. But the first philosopher, Imhotep, he presents a very, very interesting idea that death does not really start until you stop caring and stop talking. This kind of a concept just means that talking is one of the ways that power is expressed. Talking or discourse is the way, is the current that moves power along. We are influenced by the idea of talking, one way or another. That can mean writing, that can mean video, it can mean all sorts of things. Now, the result of power, especially in biblical interpretation, needs to be underscored. Carter Woodson says this: if you can control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. When you determine what a man shall think, you do not have to concern yourself about what he will do. If you make a man feel that he is inferior, you do not have to compel him to accept an inferior status, for he will seek it himself. If you make a man think that he is justly an outcast, you do not have to order him to the back door. He will go without being told. And if there is no back door, the very nature of that person will demand one. The idea that knowledge and power are so intricately connected makes power very, very difficult to understand. Our last question is, let me call it homework. Our last question is this: is there a way to disconnect knowledge from power?